Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for joining us for this.
Yeah, so today, imagine someone systematically destroying your marriage, your career, and just like your very grip on reality.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's dark right out of the gate.
Right. But imagine they aren't doing it because they hate you or because they want your money or even for some deep-seated revenge plot.
Which is usually what we expect.
Exactly. They're doing it simply because they are bored. And, playing with your mind just happens to be a highly entertaining intellectual exercise for them.
It's completely terrifying.
It really is. So today we're doing a deep dive into the ultimate blueprint for the bad faith actor. We're looking at William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Othello, The Moor of Venice. But we're not just reading the play. We're pairing the original text with the really profound, deeply psychological 19th century commentary of the essayist William Hazlitt.
Yeah, and Hazlitt's commentary, it really shifts the focus entirely because he strips away the beautiful poetry and that whole 17th century Venetian setting, and he basically forces you to look at the psychological machinery operating underneath.
Which is so valuable for us today.
Exactly. We're using his insights to understand the raw, volatile emotions that drive this play, and more specifically, the mechanics of how human beings dismantle one another.
Yeah, the mission here is urgent for you listening. We are exploring the fragile nature of trust, the devastating power of manipulation, and the toxic psychology of jealousy.
It's a total teardown of the human mind.
It is. This is an examination of how easily the human mind can be hacked and turned against itself. We want to uncover how you can guard your own, what Shakespeare calls your immediate jewel of a mind, in a world that feels completely saturated with bad faith actors.
Right. But before we get into the actual mechanics of this, the psychological hacking, we kind of have to address the framework of why we'd voluntarily subject ourselves to such a dark exploration.
Yeah, because usually when people hear the word tragedy, they just assume it's like a depressing story where people make terrible choices and die.
Yeah, like, why would I want to spend an hour on that? But Hazlitt has a much more functional, almost therapeutic take on the purpose of tragedy. He argues that the core wisdom of tragedy is its ability to, as he says, purify the affections by terror and pity.
Okay, which sounds incredibly academic on the surface.
It does, yeah.
But looking at how Hazlitt explains it, he's basically suggesting that tragedy serves as this violent shock to the system. It forces you to substitute imaginary sympathy for mere selfishness.
Right, you're pulled out of your own head.
Exactly. You're pulled out of your own microscopic, day-to-day grievances and given a high and permanent interest in humanity as a whole. He calls this making you a thoughtful spectator in the lists of life.
And that imagery, the lists of life, the lists being the medieval jousting arenas, is just so crucial.
Oh, that's what that means, the jousting arenas.
Yeah. You are watching the violent, chaotic tournament of human existence, but you're doing it from a vantage point where you can actually process the carnage without being impaled by it.
Without actually taking a lance to the chest.
Exactly. And Hazlitt is really quick to point out that Othello accomplishes this in a highly specific way compared to Shakespeare's other great works.
Yeah, because when you read Macbeth, you are dealing with witches and prophecies and the assassination of kings, right?
Mm-hmm. Massive political upheaval.
Right. And King Lear is about a monarch dividing an entire country and battling a literal hurricane on a heath. The scale is massive. But Othello, it feels so claustrophobic.
It really does. Hazlitt says it comes directly home to the bosoms and business of men.
Because it's intensely domestic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We aren't dealing with the fate of a nation here. We are dealing with a marriage. We're dealing with office politics, rumors, professional jealousy, and literally a misplaced piece of fabric.
A handkerchief.
A handkerchief, yeah. It excites our sympathy to this extraordinary degree because the scenario is agonizingly relatable to the average person. We see a man, Othello, who begins the narrative with a nature that Hazlitt describes as inherently noble, confiding, and generous.
Yeah.
His baseline operating system is absolute trust. He genuinely believes that men should be what they seem to be.
But wait, looking at this dynamic, the obvious screaming question is, if tragedy is supposed to purify us and make us thoughtful, why does exploring Othello just make you feel deeply, intensely anxious?
That's the common reaction.
You spend the entire time feeling this suffocating frustration, wanting to scream at the characters to just open their eyes. Like, where is the purification in watching a fundamentally good guy be so disastrously gullible?
Well, the anxiety is kind of the intended physiological response. Hazlitt argues that tragedy softens our stubbornness. It corrects the fatal excesses in ourselves by showing us the extreme, catastrophic consequences of unchecked passions in others.
So the discomfort forces a mirror up to the audience.
Exactly. The anxiety is the medicine.
Yeah.
You're supposed to feel the trap snapping shut on him, so you can recognize the shape of that same trap in your own life.
Wow, okay.
You feel the horror of his gullibility so that you might recognize those exact same vulnerabilities in your own mind. It forces those really uncomfortable questions like, where is my blind trust? Where do I let my emotional reactions totally override my rational faculties?
Right. But to see how those vulnerabilities get exploited, you have to look at the specific psychological makeup of the target. Othello isn't just a blank slate who gets tricked.
No, not at all.
His trust can be weaponized so effectively because of his highly precarious position in Venetian society.
This is such a critical point. Othello is a Moor. He is a highly revered military general, completely indispensable to the Venetian state when it comes to war.
They literally cannot survive without him.
Right. Yet he is undeniably a racial and cultural outsider in their high society. He's the ultimate tool for the state, but he is not one of them.
And the illusion of his acceptance shatters the literal second he crosses the boundary from military asset to family member.
Oh, absolutely.
When he marries Desdemona, her father, Brabantio, who is this powerful Venetian senator and who used to invite Othello over for dinner, by the way, completely loses his mind.
He cannot handle it.
No, Brabantio's cognitive dissonance is so severe that he literally cannot fathom his elite, wealthy daughter willingly marrying this outsider.
So he immediately resorts to accusations of witchcraft. He stands before the Duke of Venice and claims Desdemona must have been abused by charms or mixtures powerful o'er the blood.
That's just wild.
It is. He argues it goes against all rules of nature that a maiden so quiet and still would fall in love with what she feared to look on. He's desperately trying to rationalize the situation using the darkest prejudices of his society.
Right. And Othello's defense against this accusation is one of the most revealing moments in the entire text.
Yeah.
He doesn't defend himself by citing his military rank or his power, right?
No, he goes a completely different route.
He explains to the Duke that he won Desdemona through extreme radical vulnerability. He simply told her the story of his life, his brutal battles, his narrow escapes being sold into slavery, and surviving in these vast empty deserts.
And the rhetoric he uses is so sweeping. He speaks of moving accidents by flood and field and entrees vast and deserts idle.
It's just gorgeous poetry.
It is. He paints a picture of a life defined entirely by trauma and survival. And he notes that Desdemona listened with a greedy ear, like she would rush through her household affairs just to return and devour his discourse.
The foundation of their relationship is built on this intense mutual empathy. I mean, Othello says, she loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them.
Yeah, and Desdemona corroborates this. She tells the Duke, I saw Othello's visage in his mind.
Which is such a beautiful line.
It really is. She totally bypassed the societal prejudice and the physical differences to connect directly with the architecture of his soul.
It is this profound meeting of minds. But, and here's the tragic part, that exact soulful foundation, that mutual vulnerability, is the very thing that paints a massive target on Othello's back.
Because it reveals a massive internal fracture.
Yes. When you look at how Othello talks about himself in these high society settings, he suffers from a crippling case of imposter syndrome.
Oh, 100%.
He is a royal by birth in his own land. He is a tactical genius. The entire state relies on him to keep them alive. But he is acutely, painfully aware that he lacks the soft parts of conversation of the Venetian elite.
He says, rude am I in my speech.
Exactly. He has spent his life in the tented field, in the mud and the blood, and suddenly he's supposed to navigate this glittering world of delicate etiquette, doublespeak, and political maneuvering.
And Hazlitt pays really close attention to this sense of displacement. Othello's military vernacular just doesn't translate to the Venetian court. Later in the text, when the psychological poison starts taking effect, you see that exact insecurity flare up.
How so?
Well, he rationalizes his own impending betrayal by saying, haply, for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I am declined into the vale of years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he immediately points to his race, his lack of refinement, and his age as the logical reasons why his wife would betray him.
That specific insecurity, that internal whisper telling him he is inherently unlovable or that he just doesn't truly belong in this world, is exactly the fissure a predator looks for.
Right.
And Hazlitt realizes that Shakespeare didn't just write a villain here, he wrote the ultimate psychological predator in the character of Iago.
And Hazlitt's analysis of Iago is arguably his most famous contribution to the study of this text. He explicitly points out that Iago is not a traditional, passionately evil villain.
Right, he's not driven by some burning desire for revenge over a deep, tangible wrong.
Exactly. Hazlitt uses this chilling phrase. He describes Iago as an extreme example of diseased intellectual activity.
Diseased intellectual activity. That is so evocative.
It really is. And it feels like it perfectly diagnoses a very specific, highly toxic personality type we see all the time today. But grasping Iago's true nature presents a massive obstacle for the modern listener.
Oh, for sure. Because modern storytelling and modern psychology have completely conditioned us to search for the tragic backstory.
We want the prequel where the villain was bullied.
We are obsessed with the why. If a character is doing something horrific, we expect a flashback to their childhood trauma, or we want to understand the specific systemic grievance that twisted them.
We want to rationalize their evil so we can compartmentalize it.
Exactly. We want to believe that if we just fix the root cause, the evil goes away. But Iago completely defies that comfort. He has no solid structural motive for destroying Othello's life.
Right. I mean, he occasionally grasps at straws to justify himself. At one point, he mentions a rumor, saying, "It is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office." So he's suggesting Othello slept with his wife.
But the terrifying part is the very next line, right?
Yes. Where he admits he doesn't even know if it's true, nor does he really seem to care. He says, "I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety."
He is literally using a baseless rumor as a flimsy excuse to execute a horrific psychological game.
He ruins lives simply to cure his own boredom.
So does he just do it because he likes the power trip? Or is there a deeper psychological void that Hazlitt points out?
Hazlitt takes that even further. He calls Iago an amateur of tragedy in real life who plots ruins as an exercise for his ingenuity.
An amateur of tragedy in real life.
Yeah, it is entirely about the exertion of power for its own sake. Iago feels alive only when he is manipulating the variables of other people's lives and watching them crash.
The modern translation of this is so glaringly obvious. Iago is the psychological equivalent of a malicious hacker, or like the most destructive kind of internet troll.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Right. He is the guy who swats a streamer or doxes a stranger or launches a coordinated smear campaign online just to see if he can pull it off.
Yeah, it's not about justice.
No. And it's not about a personal vendetta. It's about the raw, intoxicating power of causing chaos from behind a screen of anonymity. Or, in Iago's case, from behind a screen of false honesty.
And Iago operates in that exact same dark triad psychological space. He has this coldly mechanistic view of humanity. He views human beings as machines with levers, and he considers himself the only person smart enough to pull them.
It's so cynical.
Look at how he speaks about love to Roderigo. He calls it merely a lust of the blood and a permission of the will.
Right, and when Roderigo is literally threatening suicide over losing Desdemona, Iago openly mocks his emotional state.
Because he views empathy as a fatal glitch in the human operating system.
Wow. Yes. He uses Roderigo so blatantly, repeatedly telling him to put money in thy purse with this totally false promise that Roderigo could eventually buy Desdemona's affection.
He's using this man as a personal ATM while privately despising his foolishness, laughing, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse."
It's brutal, and Hazlitt notes that Iago's mind digests only poisons. Virtue, goodness, and trust are actually offensive to him.
Because they prove that people aren't the cynical, base creatures he desperately needs them to be to justify his own worldview.
Right. He has to destroy Othello's nobility to prove to himself that nobility is just an illusion.
Exactly.
Understanding that bad faith actors like this actually exist. People who operate entirely without a rational grievance solely to assert dominance brings us to the terrifying mechanics of how they actually execute their manipulation.
Right, because Iago doesn't just walk up to Othello and declare, "Your wife is cheating on you with your Lieutenant Cassio."
No, if he did that, Othello's military brain would immediately kick in. He would demand hard evidence, investigate the claim, find the lie, and execute Iago for insubordination.
Exactly. So Iago has to bypass the rational defense systems entirely. This happens in Act 3, Scene 3, which Hazlitt considers the absolute masterpiece of psychological tension.
It really is. It is a masterclass in covert manipulation.
Iago uses what Hazlitt calls broken hints and insinuations. He plants a microscopic seed of doubt and forces Othello's own insecurity to water it.
Right. They see Cassio leaving Desdemona's presence, and Iago doesn't make an accusation. He just mutters, I like not that.
It is the power of the withheld sentence. When Othello asks him what he means, Iago feigns reluctance. He pretends he doesn't want to speak ill of a colleague.
He acts like a loyal, deeply concerned friend who is desperately trying to protect Othello from a painful reality.
Yeah, he plays hard to get, making the victim do the work of building the lie. He makes Othello beg for the poison.
This is textbook gaslighting and information warfare. Iago positions himself as the caring confidant. He even famously warns Othello to beware of jealousy, calling it the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on.
Which is the most brilliant, twisted move he makes.
Unbelievably twisted.
By warning Othello about jealousy, he is the one actively injecting the concept of jealousy into the environment, all while maintaining his cover as the honest broker. He takes Othello's own free and open nature and weaponizes it.
Let's talk about the cognitive mechanism here, because this is where confirmation bias completely takes over the brain. Othello initially demands evidence. He says, give me the ocular proof. He wants to see it with his own eyes.
Right.
But what does Iago actually provide? Circumstantial garbage.
Literally garbage. He provides a story about a dream Cassio supposedly had while they were sleeping in the same quarters, where Cassio allegedly talked in his sleep about Desdemona.
A dream.
A dream. And then he brings up the misplaced handkerchief.
Why a handkerchief? I mean, in the grand scheme of a Venetian military operation, a handkerchief is completely meaningless.
Right. Practically speaking, yes. But emotionally, because it is a token of private intimacy, it was Othello's first gift to Desdemona. So losing it isn't just losing a piece of fabric. To a mind poisoned by doubt, it represents the careless discarding of their private bond. Shakespeare writes that trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmations strong as proofs of Holy Writ.
Proofs of Holy Writ. Wow.
Yeah, once the doubt is established, the brain retroactively alters its perception of reality to fit the new paranoid narrative. Every innocent conversation Desdemona has, every smile, suddenly becomes retroactive proof of her guilt.
Think about how this mirrors the information warfare we experience today. When you're fed partial truths, out of context quotes, or subtle implications about a colleague, a political figure, or a partner.
Yeah.
How quickly does your rational mind give way to paranoia? I mean, we all want to believe we would demand ocular proof. We believe we're too smart to be manipulated.
Of course we do.
But the reality is, when our insecurities are triggered, we often just accept the fabricated dream and the out-of-context handkerchief.
Because the psychological hacking bypasses our intelligence entirely. It targets our deepest fears of inadequacy.
But looking at this dynamic, the obvious screaming question is, why doesn't he just go talk to her?
That is the tragedy of it.
Right. Why is a brilliant military tactician suddenly incapable of having a simple conversation with his own wife? Why doesn't he just pull Cassio aside and ask what's going on?
Well, Hazlitt provides a really profound insight into Othello's specific pathology here. He says Othello's blood is inflammable. He is a man of extreme, absolute action.
Which makes sense for a general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His entire life has been built on life or death decisions made in the heat of battle. Once the doubt is planted, his extreme nature cannot tolerate ambiguity.
He hates the gray area. The not knowing is physically painful to him.
He despises it. He states it plainly. To be once in doubt is once to be resolved. He prefers the horrific, agonizing certainty of betrayal to the slow, lingering torture of not knowing.
So the ambiguity is worse than the heartbreak.
Exactly. So when Iago offers him a narrative that resolves that ambiguity, even a narrative that completely destroys his life, Othello latches onto it with both hands just to escape the anxiety of doubt.
It's heartbreaking. And while Othello's rapid descent into paranoia is terrifying to watch, the way his victim reacts to this unspooling madness presents its own set of deeply uncomfortable questions, especially for us today.
Yeah, we have to focus on Desdemona and her attendant, Emilia, here. Because Hazlitt notes that Desdemona's character consists in having no will of her own, no prompter but her obedience.
Desdemona is presented throughout the text as this absolute ideal of purity, innocence, and submission.
Right.
Even when Othello becomes completely unhinged, when he publicly strikes her across the face, when he calls her horrific, degrading names in front of the Venetian emissaries, her reaction is to kneel. She says that his unkindness may defeat her life, but it will never taint my love.
And as modern guides navigating this ancient text, we have to exercise serious discernment here. Blindly endorsing Desdemona's absolute submission and her refusal to defend herself is a highly, highly dangerous concept to import into a 21st century context.
It is deeply uncomfortable. To a modern listener, we are watching a woman endure unequivocal, severe domestic abuse, and her response is to blame herself and lean further into passivity. It triggers every alarm bell we have, and it absolutely should. We do not want to promote the idea of the perfect, silent victim who accepts abuse out of some twisted sense of romantic martyrdom.
No, definitely not. But Shakespeare seems to anticipate this discomfort. He doesn't leave us solely with Desdemona's idealized perspective on womanhood and marriage. He provides Emilia, Iago's wife, and Desdemona's lady-in-waiting as a vital, gritty counterpoint.
Yeah, if Desdemona represents a heavenly, almost naive innocence, Emilia represents earthbound, hardened reality. Reading Emilia's lines feels like listening to a woman from the year 2026 who has been mysteriously dropped into a play from 1604.
It really does. Let's look at the stark contrast between them in Act 4. Desdemona is so innocent she can't even fathom the concept of infidelity. She earnestly asks Emilia, "Dost thou in conscience think that there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kind?"
She literally can't believe it happens.
Right, and Emilia's response is essentially, yes, obviously there are dozens of them, and usually it's the husband's fault.
Emilia explicitly calls out the systemic double standards of men. She delivers this incredible, highly pragmatic speech where she argues that wives have galls, meaning they have the capacity for deep anger and resentment just like men do.
Exactly. She says women have some revenge, and that they have affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have.
She is forcefully telling Desdemona that women are human beings with the exact same rights to be flawed, angry, and vindictive as their husbands.
She says, let husbands know their wives have things like them. They see and smell and have their palates both for sweet and sour. It is an incredibly modern assertion of female autonomy and a direct challenge to the patriarchal structures of the time.
So why the contrast then?
Yeah.
If Emilia possesses this modern practical wisdom, if she sees the world as it actually is, why is Desdemona the central tragedy? Why does Shakespeare force us to watch the innocent suffer while the pragmatist just stands by?
Because Desdemona's extreme, almost unnatural innocence is what makes the tragedy of her murder by Othello so utterly devastating. She is, as she calls herself, a moth of peace.
Oh, a moth of peace.
Yeah, and she is completely crushed by a war machine that has been maliciously reprogrammed by a hacker. Her innocence heightens the sheer terror of Iago's machinations. It proves that purity is no defense against targeted malice.
Right.
But Emilia's practical wisdom grounds the entire narrative in human reality, demonstrating that Shakespeare deeply understood the systemic inequalities and the silent suffering of women in his own era.
But even she doesn't escape.
Exactly. The tragedy of Emilia is that she figures out her own husband's plot too late, and when she finally speaks the truth, Iago kills her for it. She is the ultimate realist, destroyed by the same exact system.
Wow. This immense tension between idealized romance and gritty reality, between internal emotion and external action, mirrors how this play functions alongside other great wisdom texts. I want to zoom out for a second and look at the pacing of Othello's psychological collapse, because Hazlitt makes a really fascinating comparison between the architecture of Othello and the architecture of Macbeth.
Yeah, in Macbeth, Hazlitt points out that there is a violent, prolonged, agonizing struggle between ambition and conscience.
Right, it takes forever.
Macbeth wrestles with his soul. He hallucinates a dagger before he commits the murder. He hallucinates a ghost after he does it. It's a slow, grueling burn of a man watching his own morality decay.
But in Othello, the conflict is virtually non-existent. The fall happens at lightning speed.
Once Othello makes the choice to believe Iago's insinuations, he never looks back. His passion takes complete tyrannical control over his faculties. He compares his own rage to the Pontic Sea that knows no ebb, but flows relentlessly, violently onward.
It is a sudden, entire, and unforeseen mutation from unbounded confidence to the sheer, unadulterated madness of hatred.
Let's connect this to broader human concerns found in other wisdom traditions, particularly Stoicism or Buddhist mindfulness, because the danger illustrated so vividly in Othello's rapid descent is the complete and utter failure to create a space between the stimulus and the response.
Yeah, the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl famously noted that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response.
Exactly. And the stimulus here is Iago's lies. The response is Othello's murderous rage. A Stoic philosopher would argue that true freedom, true sovereignty of the mind, relies entirely on maintaining that gap.
And Othello just lacks the meditative pause.
Completely. He fundamentally lacks the ability to self-regulate. He allows an external force, Iago, and the fabricated circumstantial evidence to completely dictate his internal reality.
He surrenders the sovereignty over his own mind.
Yeah, he lets a bad faith actor seize the controls of his emotional state.
It is genuinely terrifying how fast he goes from saying, "I'll see before I doubt," to screaming, "Arise, black vengeance, from thy hollow cell."
Like, does this imply that our own grip on reality is really that fragile? Are we all just one highly convincing, perfectly tailored lie away from losing our minds?
Our grip is deeply fragile, yes, especially if we tie our peace of mind entirely to external validations, or if we demand absolute certainty in an uncertain world. Othello's fatal flaw isn't merely his jealousy, it's a profound, catastrophic lack of internal emotional regulation when faced with the unknown.
He cannot sit with the discomfort of doubt, so he chooses the certainty of destruction.
Which leads us directly to the most vital part of this deep dive, the practical application. How can we take the devastating lessons of this ancient text and apply them to our daily lives? If we bring this back to your immediate reality, this completely changes how you should audit your environments. Let's look at identifying the manipulators.
Yeah, the practice here is a ruthless audit of your informational diet. You have to look critically at your workplace, your social circles, and particularly your media feeds. You need to identify who is operating by sowing division.
Who relies on those just asking questions, insinuations? Who is constantly feeding you out of context outrage just to keep you in a state of agitation?
Remember how Iago operates. He never makes a direct accusation until Othello is already primed to believe it. He uses hints. I like not that.
So the question you have to ask yourself is, are you allowing someone with diseased intellectual activity, someone who thrives on drama, engagement metrics, or chaos, to dictate your view of people you once trusted? Are you letting a troll hack your perception of reality?
And the next application deals with taming that internal emotional storm. The reflection here is about recognizing the true parasitic nature of jealousy and paranoia. When you feel that intense, consuming jealousy, recognize it for what it is, an emotion that, as Iago says, mocks the meat it feeds on.
It consumes your peace of mind while falsely pretending to protect you from harm.
Exactly. So the practical step is to actively force a delay. You have to aggressively manufacture that space between stimulus and response that Othello lacked.
Think about it. Othello's entire tragedy, the loss of his wife and his own soul, could have been completely averted with one honest, calm conversation.
Literally one conversation.
He just had to walk into the next room and say, "Desdemona, Iago said this strange thing about your handkerchief. Can we talk about it?"
It sounds so simple, but in the grip of passion, it feels impossible. When your rational faculties, what Shakespeare calls your safer guides, are clouded by the physiological storm of jealousy or anger, you must commit to doing absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
Make no permanent decisions, send no texts, draft no emails. Do not confront the person. Wait until the physiological storm in your nervous system completely passes.
For a final piece of insight, let's examine Othello's final moments. He realizes, tragically too late, the absolute horror of what he has done. He looks at the wreckage of his life and describes himself as a man who loved not wisely but too well. And he says he was perplexed in the extreme.
He was indeed perplexed in the extreme, manipulated by a master, but he also made a choice. He chose to protect his own honor, his pride, and his public image over his love for Desdemona.
He couldn't bear the thought of being perceived as the foolish cuckolded husband in the eyes of Venetian society.
Right. The practical lesson buried in his final speech is about the absolute necessity of surrendering ego in our deepest relationships.
This is the reflection that really haunts me after reading this. The real tragedy isn't just that Othello was too trusting. It's that he placed his trust in the wrong worldview. He trusted the cynical, hard truth pessimism of Iago rather than the gentle, vulnerable truth of Desdemona.
Yes.
He fundamentally thought the cynic was the realist.
And that is a profound and incredibly common modern trap. We constantly mistake cynicism for wisdom. We assume that the person telling us the darkest, worst possible thing about humanity is the only one seeing things clearly.
Exactly. Iago sounded like a gritty pragmatist to Othello, while Desdemona's innocent, steadfast love sounded like a naive fairy tale. Othello chose to believe the nightmare because it felt more real to his deeply insecure mind.
Iago exploited the murkiness of Othello's insecurities. He thrived in the muddy waters of that imposter syndrome, proving that if you can control what a person focuses on, if you can dictate their fears, you can control their entire reality.
He weaponized Othello's own mind against him, turning his greatest strengths, his decisive action, and his open nature into the very instruments of his destruction.
Truly a tragedy.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own today. Building on that terrifying idea of mistaking cynicism for realism, what if the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves isn't that others are secretly betraying us, but that our own cynicism is a form of wisdom?
That's a powerful question.
We build these massive, impenetrable fortresses of paranoia because we think it keeps us safe from the Iagos of the world. We assume that if we trust no one, we can never be hacked. But perhaps true wisdom requires the immense, terrifying courage to remain open, to remain vulnerable, and to keep trusting even when we know the world is full of bad actors. Because locking up your immediate jewel in a vault of cynicism might just slowly destroy the very soul you're trying so desperately to protect.
Absolutely beautifully said.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.